The small town of Ridgewood sat quietly on the edge of nowhere, surrounded by pale hills and long, winding roads that disappeared into the woods. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than the wind, and secrets never stayed buried for long. The houses were old, some still painted in fading colors from decades ago, and the streets were lined with tall maple trees that turned gold every autumn. At the far end of Willow Lane stood the Whitmore residence, a large white house with wide porches, perfectly trimmed hedges, and a polished brass gate that caught the sunlight like gold. From the outside, it looked like a picture of comfort and success, the kind of home you'd expect to see on a magazine cover. Inside, however, the air always felt a little too quiet, like everyone was pretending things were fine when they were. The Whitmores were the kind of family people admired from a distance. Henry Whitmore was a lawyer known for his sharp mind and colder heart. His wife, Evelyn, was polite but distant, always keeping her tone light even when her words cut deep. They had 2 children, Megan, a spoiled 17-year-old who moved through life like she owned it, and Caleb, the quiet, obedient son who followed rules without question. And then there was the adopted daughter, Lena. She wasn't part of the family by blood, and she never forgot that. Lena had arrived at the Whitmore home when she was 10. She'd come from a foster home in the city, where she'd spent most of her life waiting for someone to want her. The Whitmores had seemed like angels then, kind, generous, smiling at her like she was finally going to have a real family. For years, she tried her best to fit in. She helped Evelyn in the kitchen, stayed quiet at the dinner table, and earned top grades at school. But no matter how hard she tried, she always felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. There were moments when Henry would look at her as if she reminded him of something unpleasant, and Evelyn's polite smiles grew colder with time. Even Megan made sure she never forgot her place, teasing her, borrowing her things, and whispering to friends that Lena was just the charity case. Still, Lena didn't complain. She kept her head down, worked part-time at a local cafe, and saved whatever she could. The people in town liked her, kind-hearted, soft-spoken, and hardworking. To them, she was proof that good things could grow even in hard soil. But behind closed doors, the cracks were widening. Evelyn started leaving subtle reminders of Lena's difference, how much she cost to raise, how she should be grateful for what she has. Henry grew impatient, quick to scold her for even the smallest mistakes. Megan's words became crueler. It was as if they had all decided without saying it aloud that Lena no longer belonged. It began with small things, missing clothes, money from her wallet, whispers when she entered the room. One evening, Megan accused her of stealing a necklace that belonged to their late grandmother. Evelyn's voice was sharp when she demanded answers, and Henry's glare made it clear there was no point in arguing. Lena swore she didn't take it, but her words fell on deaf ears. They didn't need proof. They just needed a reason. That night, she heard them talking in the living room, soft but firm voices deciding her fate. She packed her small bag quietly, knowing before they even said it that she would have to leave. The morning she was thrown out, the sky was gray and heavy with rain. Evelyn handed her an envelope with a few bills inside and said it was for now. Henry didn't look at her. Megan stood on the porch, smirking as Lena stepped off the property, her clothes soaked, her heart heavier than the sky above her. There were no tears, just silence. She walked down Willow Lane, past the houses where the neighbors pretended not to see, and kept walking until Ridgewood was nothing but a blur behind her. For days, she stayed at the bus station, sleeping on a bench and trying to figure out what came next. She didn't have anyone, no friends close enough to call, no family to return to. She was alone in a world that had already decided she wasn't worth keeping. But sometimes fate plays cruel jokes. The day her life changed again, she was sitting on the same bench watching cars go by when she heard the deep rumble of engines overhead. A jet was descending, not the kind that ever landed near Ridgewood. People stopped in the street, pointing up at the sky as it disappeared beyond the trees toward the small airfield just outside town. Minutes later, a line of black cars rolled through the main road, stopping near the very same bus station where she sat. The rain had stopped. The air was still. The car doors opened, and men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the area before one of them opened the door of the sleek jet-black sedan. The man who stepped out looked like he didn't belong in this world of quiet towns and worn-down roads. He was tall, dressed in black, his expression unreadable. And standing beside him, stepping out of another car, was a face everyone in town recognized, the president himself. Every pair of eyes turned, people whispered, and Lena, clutching her worn-out bag, had no idea what was happening until the tall man turned toward her. His eyes softened when they met hers as if he'd been searching for her for years. He walked up to her without hesitation, and for the first time in days, someone said her name, not like a curse, not like pity, but like it mattered. That moment, the rain-soaked girl, the stunned town, the man stepping out of a car beside the most powerful figure in the country, was when everything began to unravel. Ridgewood had seen strange things before, but nothing like this. What started as an act of cruelty by one family would soon expose truths buried deep under layers of wealth, lies, and guilt. The Whitmores had thought they'd gotten rid of a burden. What they didn't know was that the girl they threw away was about to return, with more power than any of them could ever imagine. The days after Lena's disappearance from the Whitmore home passed quietly, almost too quietly. Evelyn carried on her routines as if nothing had happened. The breakfast table was a little emptier, the air lighter, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the uncomfortable presence of eyes that reminded her of something she didn't want to face. Henry returned to work, drowning himself in case files and courtroom appearances, rarely speaking to anyone unless necessary. Megan seemed to enjoy the new normal the most. She bragged to her friends that Lena had been caught stealing and that her parents had done the right thing. But behind the polished surface of their perfect family life, something had shifted, something they couldn't control. It started with rumors. Ridgewood was a town that fed on whispers, and people had started asking questions. Where's the Whitmore's adopted daughter? Why did she leave so suddenly? The Whitmores tried to keep the story simple. Lena had run away after getting into trouble, but the unease spread anyway. Evelyn noticed the way people looked at her in the grocery store, how conversations stopped when she walked by. Henry received calls from a few clients who, in a strangely polite way, asked if the family matter would affect his reputation. It wasn't just the shame of it, it was the control slipping away. Meanwhile, Lena's life had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. The man who had arrived at the bus station, the one who had stepped out of that black car beside the president, was named Adrian Cole. He was 25, a successful entrepreneur from one of the most powerful business families in the country. They had met months earlier before everything fell apart when he came to Ridgewood to visit an old school friend. He had wandered into the cafe where Lena worked. She was serving coffee, quiet and shy, with her hair tied back and her hands trembling slightly as she spoke to customers. Adrian had been drawn to her not because of her looks, but because she spoke differently from everyone else he met. She didn't flatter him or act impressed by his name. She treated him like a person, not a story. That small act of kindness, unnoticed by anyone else, had stayed with him long after he left town. They had kept in touch secretly, messages late at night, calls that lasted hours. Adrian learned about her life, her dreams, and the walls she lived behind. She never complained about her adopted family, but her pauses spoke more than words. When she stopped replying one day, he knew something was wrong. And when he finally found her at that bus station, her eyes swollen from crying but her spirit somehow still intact, he made a silent promise that no one would ever treat her that way again. The news of Adrian's arrival spread through Ridgewood within hours. People talked about the convoy of black cars, about how the president himself had been there, though no one could figure out why. The Whitmores heard about it that evening during dinner. Megan was scrolling through her phone when she froze, staring at a photo posted online. Lena standing beside Adrian Cole, his arm protectively around her as security escorted them toward the jet. Evelyn's fork slipped from her hand. Henry's face went pale. They didn't understand how a girl like her could end up next to someone like him. At first, they convinced themselves it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she had lied to him, pretended to be someone else. But when the story appeared on national news the next day, showing Adrian Cole's public statement thanking the woman who reminded him what loyalty means, their world began to shake. Reporters dug into Lena's story. The headline read, "Billionaire's girlfriend was abandoned by adoptive family. Now they regret it." The Whitmore's name appeared everywhere. People began connecting the dots. The family matter, the missing girl, the accusations. Overnight, the Whitmores went from respected to despised. Henry tried to control the narrative, but the media didn't care about his version. Evelyn became paranoid, refusing to leave the house. Megan's friends turned on her, whispering that her family had abused Lena. The same town that once admired them now crossed the street to avoid them. The more they tried to defend themselves, the worse it got. And in the middle of it all, Lena remained silent. But fame brought its own kind of pressure. Adrian's family didn't approve of her. They were polite in public but sharp in private. His mother called Lena a distraction, while business partners warned him that being with a girl from a troubled background would damage his reputation. Adrian didn't care. He adored her, but his world was one of constant exposure, and soon Lena began to feel trapped in a new kind of cage. She went from being invisible to being watched by millions. Her photos were everywhere, what she wore, where she went, who she spoke to. People created stories about her, twisting her life into entertainment. She missed the quiet, the anonymity, even the bus station bench. And beneath all that glamour, guilt festered. She hadn't wanted revenge, but she couldn't stop it either. When reporters exposed details about the Whitmores' financial struggles, Henry's debts, Evelyn's failed investments, it wasn't her doing, yet she couldn't deny that part of her felt satisfaction watching them unravel. Every cruel word, every cold stare, every night she'd gone to bed hungry, it all came back like echoes finally finding their voice. But that satisfaction soon turned to fear when she realized someone was following her. It began with small things. Strange cars parked near her apartment, messages with no sender ID, a shadow she thought she saw outside her window one night. Adrian brushed it off as paranoia, but she knew fear too well to mistake it. Then came the letter slipped under her door. You think you can ruin us and walk away. You belong where you came from. Henry had reached his breaking point. His law firm was losing clients. His reputation was shattered. Reporters camped outside their home, shouting questions about the girl they threw out. Evelyn barely spoke anymore, packing the halls like a ghost. Megan cried every night, her social life destroyed, her name a trending topic for all the wrong reasons. The family that once looked flawless now looked rotten from within. And deep down, Henry blamed Lena. He convinced himself that she had orchestrated everything, that she had turned Adrian and the media against them. In his mind, she wasn't a victim anymore. She was the enemy. Adrian, on the other hand, was starting to see another side of the story. His family's private investigator found records, documents that showed the Whitmores had used government adoption funds years after Lena turned 18, money they weren't entitled to. Old medical reports were suggesting emotional neglect, even psychological abuse. Adrian wanted justice for her, but Lena begged him not to make it worse. "They'll just hate me more," she said softly one night. "I just want to move on." But moving on wasn't an option anymore. The story had taken on a life of its own. Whitmore's home became a fortress of paranoia. Henry started drinking. Evelyn found comfort in sleeping pills. Megan, desperate to escape the humiliation, began messaging Adrian behind Lena's back, apologizing, pretending to care, asking to meet. At first, he ignored her, but when she showed up at a charity gala uninvited, dressed in red and crying on live television, the scandal deepened. The tabloids called it the adopted daughter and the jealous heiress. For the world, it was entertainment. For those inside it, it was poison. One night, Lena confronted Megan outside the hotel where the gala had been held. The lights from passing cars flickered across their faces as they stood in the rain. "Why are you doing this?" Lena asked, her voice breaking. "Haven't you taken enough from me?" Megan's mascara ran down her cheeks. "You ruined my family," she shouted. "You think you deserve him, you're nothing without us." The words hit harder than any slap. Adrian arrived moments later, pulling Lena away, but the damage was done. Cameras caught the confrontation. By morning, every channel played the clip, twisting it into another drama. The tension became unbearable. Lena's dreams turned into nightmares, visions of her old home, Evelyn's cold smile, and Henry's piercing stare. Adrian tried to keep her safe, hearing guards, moving her to a private estate outside the city. But even there, peace felt temporary. Each day, more secrets surfaced, financial fraud, lies about her adoption, missing documents about her birth parents. It became clear that the Whitmores hadn't adopted her out of kindness. There was something darker behind it. Late one evening, Adrian received a call from a journalist claiming to have proof that Lena's adoption had been arranged illegally, possibly linked to a black market agency that moved children for profit under the guise of foster care. The journalist was willing to meet, but he warned that the Whitmores were already trying to silence him. That was the moment everything tipped from scandal into danger. Henry, desperate and humiliated, began planning something irrational. He was losing everything, his career, his family, his reputation, and in his mind there was only one person to blame. Evelyn, detached and fatting into her own numbness, didn't notice how far he'd gone. Megan fed his anger with her tears and accusations. "She's destroying us, Dad," she whispered one night. "She won't stop until we're ruined." Outside their gates, cameras still flashed, but inside something darker was brewing. The same house that once felt suffocatingly perfect now felt haunted by its own secrets. Henry stared at Lena's old room, the one they'd emptied after she left. It was bare now, except for a single photo left behind, Lena and Megan as children, smiling for a school project, pretending to be sisters. He picked it up, stared at it for a long time, and in that silence something in him snapped. The calm before the storm had ended. The tension that had simmered beneath years of pretense had finally reached its breaking point. What came next wouldn't be gossip or scandal, it would be something far darker. And when it happened, Ridgewood would never forget the name Whitmore again. It happened on a night when the air felt heavy enough to choke on. The city had been washed clean by hours of rain, the streets glistening under pale yellow streetlights. Somewhere beyond the sound of traffic, thunder rolled far in the distance, soft at first, then low and trembling, as if warning that something was about to go terribly wrong. In the Cole family's private estate, surrounded by iron gates and motion sensors, Lena sat by the window of her room, staring at the reflection of her own face. Her eyes looked tired, her expression distant. She'd been having trouble sleeping for days, haunted by dreams of the Whitmore house. The scent of polish and perfume, Evelyn's voice echoing through long, empty hallways, and Megan's laughter turning sharp and cruel. No matter how far she had come, she couldn't escape what they had done to her. Adrian was away that evening, attending a late meeting with investors. He had insisted she stay inside, promising he'd be back before midnight. But Lena didn't like being alone anymore. The guards outside gave her a false sense of safety. Sometimes she thought she saw movement near the fence, shadows that weren't supposed to be there. Tonight, the silence felt wrong, too still. Even the hum of the city in the distance seemed muted. At 10:43 p.m., the power flickered. The house went dark for half a second, and when the lights returned, something deep inside Lena's chest tightened. She walked to the door, calling out softly to one of the guards. No answer. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone. The screen wouldn't light up. The Wi-Fi was down. Then, from outside, came the faint crunch of footsteps on wet gravel. Henry Whitmore had been watching the estate for days. He had followed Lena's routines, noted the shift changes of the guards, and waited for a night just like this, dark, quiet, and rainy. In his mind, this wasn't murder. It was a restoration. She had ruined his life, humiliated his family, and taken everything from him. His law firm was gone, his marriage was nothing but cold silence, and Megan barely spoke anymore. He told himself that she deserved this, that God himself would understand. He wasn't driven by hatred anymore. He was driven by the desperate need to make it stop. He'd parked the car half a mile away and walked the rest of the distance, wearing black gloves and a raincoat that clung to his body. The letter he'd received earlier that week from a journalist had pushed him past the edge. It confirmed what he feared most, that Lena had agreed to an interview that would expose everything. The fraud, the abuse, the illegal adoption papers. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't bear to see his name destroyed in every paper, his daughter whispered about as the villain. The estate's back entrance was easy enough to reach. He'd watched the guards leave for a shift change just as they always did around 10. When the lights flickered, it gave him his window. He slipped inside through the kitchen door, silent as a shadow. The marble floors glistened under faint emergency lights. The house smelled faintly of jasmine and rain. Every creak sounded too loud, every breath like thunder in his chest. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from adrenaline. Upstairs, Lena heard the faint sound of movement, soft, calculated. She froze, her heart hammering. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky, no response. She took a step back, her bare feet brushing against the carpet, eyes darting toward the bedroom door. Then she saw it, the faint outline of a figure moving past the hall mirror. Her throat tightened. She knew that shape. Even in the dark, she recognized the posture, the slow, deliberate way of walking. "Henry," she whispered. The word slipped out before she could stop it. For a moment, there was silence. Then his voice came through the darkness, low and hollow. "You shouldn't have done this, Lena." She backed away, her fingers fumbling for the lamp switch. The light came on, and for the first time in years, their eyes met again. He looked older, thinner, almost unrecognizable, but the rage was the same. His coat was soaked, his jaw clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack. In his hand, he held something small, a pistol, trembling slightly as he pointed it toward her. "Henry, please," she said softly, her voice cracking. "You don't have to do this." "You ruined me," he whispered. "Do you even understand what you've done? My wife doesn't sleep. My daughter hides in her room. People spit my name in the streets because of you." "I never wanted that," Lena said, tears filling her eyes. "I didn't talk to the press. I just wanted to forget." "Liar," his voice broke. "Everything was fine until you came. We gave you a home and you—" He stopped, shaking his head. "You poisoned it." She stepped closer, her hands up, palms open. "You took me in because you wanted something to fix," she said softly. "But I wasn't broken, Henry. You just couldn't stand that I reminded you of everything you hate about yourself." The words hit like a slap. His eyes twitched, his grip tightening on the gun. For a second he looked lost, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, realizing how far he's about to fall. Then something behind him creaked. Adrian had arrived early. He'd sensed something was wrong when Lena didn't answer his calls. As his car pulled up, the security lights were out, the guards missing. He ran through the rain, his shoes splashing through puddles, heart pounding as he unlocked the front door and stepped into silence. The sound of his voice echoed through the hall. Lena. Henry flinched. The sound pulled him back to the present. Panic spread across his face. He's here, he muttered. He can't see this. Lena took another step, slowly, carefully, her eyes never leaving his. You can walk away, she whispered. Please. But Henry wasn't listening anymore. He was trapped between shame and fury, between the past and the present. Every part of him screamed that he was losing control, but the part that still felt like a father, the man who once believed he was good, was dying inside him. His finger hovered over the trigger, shaking violently. Then Adrian appeared at the top of the stairs, his eyes wide as he saw them, the gun, the fear, the tears on Lena's face. Henry, he shouted, stepping forward, put it down. The shout broke whatever fragile control was left. Henry turned sharply, his nerves snapping like wires under tension. In that instant, the gun went off. The sound tore through the house like thunder. Lena screamed as Adrian stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, thick and metallic. Henry froze, staring at what he'd done. His hand trembled, the gun falling from his grip and clattering to the floor. Lena dropped to her knees beside Adrian, pressing her hands against the wound, her tears mixing with blood. Stay with me, please, she cried. Henry backed away, eyes wide, whispering, no, 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 as if trying to undo it by saying the words. He didn't mean to shoot him, not really. He'd only wanted to scare her, to stop her. But now the reality hit him all at once. The noise, the blood, the sight of Lena holding him. He stumbled toward the door, shaking uncontrollably. Outside, the storm had returned, lightning splitting the sky in two. The guards, hearing the shot, rushed back toward the house. Henry saw the flashing lights from their cars and realized he was trapped. He turned, one last look at Lena. You destroyed us, he said quietly. All of us. Then he ran into the rain, vanishing into the darkness before anyone could stop him. Inside, chaos erupted. Adrian's security team stormed the house, shouting orders into radios, calling for an ambulance. Lena sat on the floor, covered in his blood, her whole body trembling. He's going to die because of me, she kept whispering over and over. When the paramedics arrived, they carried Adrian out on a stretcher, still conscious but fatting fast. His hand reached out weakly toward her. Not your fault, he mumbled before his eyes closed. As the flashing red and blue lights painted the walls, the truth of what had just happened began to sink in. The air felt thick with fear and guilt. The perfect, quiet girl whom her family had once thrown away was now the center of a crime that would make headlines across the nation. Hours later, police found Henry's car abandoned near the old river bridge. His coat was there, drenched in rain, the gun missing. No one knew if he had jumped, fled, or simply vanished. Evelyn was found later that night in her home, sitting motionless in the dark, holding a photo of her family. When the officers told her what had happened, she didn't cry. She only whispered, "He was trying to fix it," before closing her eyes. By dawn, Ridgewood was awake again. Sirens, reporters, the echo of tragedy hanging over the small town. The world that had once judged Lena now pitied her, but pity felt like another kind of curse. She stood in the hospital corridor, her hands still stained with dried blood, staring out the window as the first light touched the city. Somewhere out there, Henry was either dead or hiding. Adrian was alive but fighting for his life. The Whitmore name was destroyed forever. And Lena, the girl who had only ever wanted to belong, realized that no matter how far she ran, the past had always been waiting for her, patient, cruel, and ready to take everything she loved. The rain that had soaked the city that night carried on until morning, washing away the blood on the driveway, but not the memory of it. By the time the sun rose, the Cole estate was surrounded by flashing lights, reporters, and police barriers. The story spread like wildfire, Billionaire airshot in confrontation linked to adoptive family scandal. News vans lined the road, cameras pointed at the gates that once symbolized wealth and security. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The echoes of shouting, the ringing gunshot, and Lena's cries still lingered in the air, even after the chaos had cleared. Lena sat on a blanket near the staircase, staring at the blood on her hands. It didn't feel real. She could still smell the gunpowder, still see Adrian's body collapsing into her arms. The officers tried to talk to her, but their words sounded distant, muffled like underwater voices. When they asked if she wanted medical attention, she shook her head. The only thing she wanted to know was if he was alive. At the hospital, Adrian lay unconscious. The bullet had missed his heart by less than an inch, tearing through muscle and bone but sparing his life by sheer chance. The doctors called it a miracle. Lena stayed in the hallway outside his room, refusing to leave even when her body gave in to exhaustion. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. Her mind kept replaying the moment Henry's finger pulled the trigger, the way his face twisted, not out of rage, but out of fear and regret. In her dreams, she saw both men, Adrian bleeding in her arms and Henry running into the rain, disappearing like smoke. The police launched a full investigation. Henry Whitmore was now a fugitive wanted for attempted murder and multiple counts of fraud. The evidence stacked quickly: financial records, forged documents, and testimonies from people who had worked in his office. The man who once stood tall in the courtroom, commanding respect with every word, was now hunted like a criminal. Reporters gathered outside the Whitmore residence, hopping for a statement. The once proud White House on Willow Lane was no longer a symbol of success. The shutters were closed, the garden overgrown, and the air around it felt cold. Evelyn refused to answer questions. When the police came to question her, she sat in the living room with a cup of untouched tea, her hands trembling slightly. Her voice was empty, detached. "He didn't mean to hurt her," she said quietly. "He just wanted it to stop." Megan, who had always craved attention, now avoided it like poison. Her social media accounts vanished overnight. She stopped going to school, stopped talking to her friends. When a reporter found her outside a small grocery store, she looked nothing like the confident girl Ridgewood once knew. Her eyes were sunken, her voice barely a whisper. "They'll never understand," she said when asked about her father. "He wasn't a monster, he just broke." The town's sympathy for the Whitmores evaporated. The same neighbors who once admired their family now spoke of them with disgust. Some said they'd always suspected something dark behind the perfect smiles. Others pitied them, calling it a tragedy of pride and secrets. But one thing was certain: no one saw them as victims anymore. For Lena, the weeks that followed felt like walking through a fog. Adrian eventually woke up, his voice weak but steady. When he saw her, he smiled faintly and said, "I told you I'd come back." She broke down then, sobbing against his chest. But even that relief couldn't erase the guilt that clung to her. She blamed herself for everything, for staying silent, for letting the story spiral, for not warning Adrian sooner. Every headline, every news broadcast, every interview that mentioned her name felt like a wound reopening. When detectives asked her to give a full statement, she struggled to speak. Her hands trembled as she described the night of the shooting, the fear in Henry's eyes, the shaking gun, the single sound that changed everything. The officer across from her nodded gently, writing it all down. "You're not the one on trial," he said, but that didn't matter. In her mind, she was. Henry's disappearance turned into national news. Weeks passed with no trace, no credit card use, no witnesses, no sightings. Some believed he had fled the country. Others believed he'd jumped from the old river bridge where his coat was found. The police dredged the waters but found nothing. Without a body, the case hovered between open and unresolved, leaving everyone trapped in uncertainty. Evelyn moved out of Ridgewood, unable to bear the whispers. Megan followed soon after. The Whitmore home was left abandoned, the windows boarded up, the mailbox stuffed with unanswered letters. Adrian's recovery took months. The bullet had left him with pain that would never fully go away, a constant reminder of how close he'd come to dying. But it changed him in other ways, too. The man who had once lived in boardrooms and luxury hotels now moved quietly, speaking only when he needed to. He rarely smiled. The media wanted interviews, documentaries, statements about justice, but he refused them all. His only concern was Lena. They spent most days away from the public eye, living quietly in a lakeside home far from the noise. But silence, they learned, doesn't always mean peace. Some nights Lena would wake up screaming, gasping for air as she saw Henry's face again. Adrian would hold her until she calmed, whispering that it was over. But deep down, both knew it never truly would be. The story of the Whitmores became a kind of modern parable, how greed and pride can rot even the most perfect-looking family. Journalists wrote about it for years. True crime shows called it the adopted daughter case. They dramatized it, exaggerated it, turning Lena's pain into entertainment. She refused every interview. She didn't want fame or pity. She wanted to disappear. Still, there were days she found herself walking past a newsstand or hearing her name on the radio. Sometimes she caught a glimpse of the Whitmore house on television, filmed from a distance, now nothing more than a decaying shell. The shutters flapping in the wind, the porch light long broken, it looked haunted, and in a way it was. That house had devoured everyone who lived in it. The law eventually closed its file on Henry Whitmore. With no body and no new evidence, he was declared legally dead after 2 years. Evelyn never remarried. Megan left the country and changed her last name. Their legacy ended not with a trial, but with silence. For Lena, healing was slow. Therapy helped her understand that guilt and responsibility weren't the same thing. But the scars ran deep. Some days she found herself staring at the sky, wondering if forgiveness was even possible, for Henry, for herself, or for the child she used to be who just wanted to be loved. Adrian often told her that she was stronger than she believed, but strength felt meaningless when she thought about how it all began, with one act of cruelty, one door closed on a rainy morning. That single moment had set everything in motion. Ridgewood never forgot. People still spoke of the girl who returned in a private jet, the family who fell apart because of their lies, and the night that ended it all. The story became a kind of warning told in whispers, that no amount of money could hide the truth forever, and that cruelty always finds its way back home. In the quiet of their new life, Lena sometimes wrote in a journal, not for the world, not for the press, just for herself. Her handwriting was shaky, uneven, but the words came like slow rain. I used to think being thrown away was the worst thing that could happen to me. But now I know, the worst thing is when people who are supposed to love you forget that you're human. She closed the notebook, set it beside her, and looked out at the lake. The water was calm that evening, a thin mist rising from its surface. Somewhere far away, thunder rumbled softly. But this time, she didn't flinch. For the first time in a long while, the storm didn't scare her anymore. Years passed before the world truly let go of the Whitmore case, though its shadow never fully lifted. The story became one of those modern myths, whispered about in classrooms, revisited in documentaries, and analyzed by journalists long after the cameras left Ridgewood. It was no longer just about one family or one crime. It had become a mirror reflecting the fragility of privilege, the corrosion of guilt, and how love and cruelty can coexist beneath the same roof. When the courts officially declared Henry Whitmore dead, it did not feel like justice. It felt like an unfinished sentence. The investigation into his financial crimes concluded posthumously, and the companies he built crumbled within months. Investors turned away, partnerships dissolved, and the Whitmore name, once carved in gold, was erased from the firm's marble lobby. For Evelyn, it was the quiet end of a life built on illusions. She moved to a coastal town, sold everything she owned, and lived out her days in solitude. No one recognized her there, not as the elegant wife of a lawyer, not as the mother of Ridgewood's perfect family, but as a tired woman who spent her mornings feeding birds and staring at the sea. Megan reinvented herself in Europe. She took her mother's maiden name, enrolled in art school, and rarely spoke of her past. But no matter how many paintings she made, she couldn't escape the colors of memory, the reds and blacks that always found their way into her work. Critics praised her for her haunting emotional depth, unaware that every brushstroke was a confession. Adrian and Lena, meanwhile, built a life that existed somewhere between silence and survival. Adrian recovered physically, but the psychological scars remained. His sense of control, the foundation of his identity, had been shattered. In interviews, he often declined to discuss his father's crimes. But when pressed by reporters, his only response was quiet and final. Some truths don't belong in headlines. He used his wealth differently after the shooting. Instead of corporate ventures, he funded programs for orphaned and abandoned children, creating scholarships and safe homes. Many saw it as an act of redemption. For Lena, it was more complicated. Each building that bore his foundation's name reminded her of what had been taken and what little could be given back. Lena chose a quieter path. She left the public eye entirely, refusing book deals, interviews, and documentaries. She found peace in small acts, teaching art therapy at a children's center, planting gardens, and writing journals she never meant anyone to read. She still carried the trauma, the sound of that gunshot buried deep inside her memory, but she had stopped running from it. Healing, she realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the echo. Her last visit to Ridgewood came on a cold spring morning, years after the tragedy. The Whitmore house was gone, demolished by the city after a fire broke out in the abandoned structure. In its place was an empty lot overgrown with wild grass. She stood there for a long time, remembering the laughter, the anger, the dinner table arguments, and the nights she spent wishing she belonged. The ghosts were still there, invisible but heavy in the air. She placed a single lily on the ground before leaving. It wasn't forgiveness she offered, it was release. The crime left deep marks not only on those directly involved, but also on the community itself. Ridgewood changed. The residents, once obsessed with appearances, grew wary of perfection. The tragedy had exposed something ugly beneath their manicured lawns and charity galas, the silent pressure to maintain an image, even when it rots the soul. Churches preached about morality. Schools introduced programs on empathy and mental health. And slowly, the town began to understand that evil doesn't always wear a villain's face. It can wear a smile, live next door, and host the neighborhood barbecue. In the years that followed, journalists and sociologists dissected the case. Some saw it as a study of power and control, how patriarchal dominance and wealth create illusions of invincibility. Others interpreted it as a tragedy born from emotional neglect, showing how love twisted by pride and shame becomes a weapon. But for Lena, none of those theories mattered. To her, it was simply a story about broken people breaking others and the impossible task of rebuilding what's left. If there was justice, it came not from the courts but from the quiet dismantling of everything Henry had built. His empire fell. His reputation rotted. The family he tried to protect through lies dissolved into anonymity. There were no heroes, only survivors. The broader world, however, learned its own lessons. The Whitmore case sparked national discussions about adoption ethics, domestic secrecy, and the psychological cost of image-based success. Lawmakers reviewed oversight in family court systems. Social workers spoke more openly about the unseen suffering of children in perfect homes. Society began to question why appearances held more value than honesty, and how many others like Lena might still be out there, unheard, unseen. And beneath all those debates ran a quieter theme, the moral complexity of forgiveness. Could Henry be seen only as a monster or also as a man crushed by his own deceit? Could Lena forgive herself for surviving something that destroyed everyone else? Could Adrian ever separate love from guilt? The answers weren't clean or comforting, but they didn't need to be. The story's power lay in its ambiguity, in showing that justice isn't always neat, and morality rarely comes in black and white. In the end, the Whitmore tragedy wasn't about crime. It was about the slow unraveling of truth. About what happens when people hide their pain until it turns into violence. About how wealth and power can delay consequences, but never erase them. It was a cautionary tale, not about monsters, but about ordinary people who lost themselves trying to be extraordinary. Years later, when a journalist wrote a retrospective piece titled "The Whitmore Case, 10 Years Later," she ended it with a line that echoed through the nation. We remember them not for what they had, but for what they lost, their truth, their peace, their humanity. For Lena, those words finally felt right. She clipped the article, folded it gently, and placed it inside her old journal. On the first page, she wrote her final reflection, a quiet truth she had earned through pain and survival. Justice is not found in punishment or revenge. It's found in the courage to live after everything you loved has burned. And for the first time in years, when she looked out over the lake at sunset, she didn't see ghosts anymore. She saw her own reflection, fragile, flawed, and free.